So in the second essay on consequences, and the implications of there being no consequences, I use the example of controversies that have really engulfed the government of Boris Johnson over the last period of time, to illustrate the differences between the Australian political context and the British one. Australian Prime Ministers have infinitely more capacity and support in central government to shape their own advisory systems, to put infrastructure around themselves. And that infrastructure allows them to really dominate their own party rooms. Now, you might say, well, look, we've seen a series of prime ministers replaced. Yeah, we have over a period of time. But for the most part, Australian prime ministers get to exercise discipline and control through the institutional resources that they've built around themselves, a powerful Prime Minister's office, a Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And they use that to try to maintain discipline and coherence across the government. It's not a conspiracy. It's been really about professionalisation and trying to maintain coordination and coherence across the business of government. And Morrison has inherited that, and he's shaped that. By contrast, Boris Johnson has a pretty shambolic number 10, and that's becoming clearer and clearer. But because he has such a thumping majority of 80 seats, he was able to maintain discipline on the Tory benches and was a pretty powerful, leader-centred Prime Minister. Recent controversies have really weakened his hold on his own party, and it's all been his own doing. And one of the consequences of leader-centredness, the permanent campaign, the balance really shifting to media control and controlling the message, is that policy and long-term thinking have just completely slipped away. And this is why we need to care about consequences, because we want, as citizens, the focus to be on long-term policy reform and change to enable us to be, prosperous, to have the capacity to respond to pandemics or whatever else, security threats or other issues, disasters. So this is kind of one of the implications of these two leaders that I was trying to draw attention to. Not to say that this has never happened before, but just to say it's taking on a very particular characteristic now. When, there was some party indiscipline in the last two sitting weeks of Parliament, 5 members of the coalition and the sort of the right wing of the Liberal Party, male members, crossed the floor. The single woman who did, Tasmanian Bridget Archer, member for Bass, holder of a marginal seat, crossed the floor to support Helen Haynes's integrity bill. She gets hauled in to a meeting in the Prime Minister's office. So there were a couple of sort of things about that were very interesting, both in terms of the problem that has dogged the Prime Minister all year around women and the gender dynamic, and of course he's deeply unpopular with women in the wake of the Women's March and so on. So the coalition agreement, allows the National Party to do a range of things. Of course, the Queensland Liberal National Party is a beast of its own that creates discipline problems, but it seems to have more latitude, and the male members of that seem to have a lot more latitude than the female member who was trying to speak out about something. And I guess, fundamentally, I was very struck by the women's leadership that was being exercised and how that was dealt with across the Parliament, and not just only in the coalition, but, the response from this unelected group in the PMO, among whom party strategists are very prominent. Now, this is not the first time. This began, in the Hawke years, and it's kind of ramped up on a trajectory. But I just wonder about ministers and parliamentarians and the party room where that features in that. And I think a lot of the dissent and a lot of the backgrounding that we're hearing, particularly from retiring MPs, like John Alexander, the member for Bennelong, and others, are sort of saying, listen, the average MP can't really influence anything. And we saw that, of course, in the terrific research that was done on the allocation of grants. If you're a safe seat holder, well, you can forget about anything much. I don't think that's what the public expects, and so we need to care about how those practices of the Parliament are working and the emergence of this very strong prime ministerial architecture. So I think the view has become among contemporary leaders that, oh, you can't do the hard stuff, there's no appetite, you have to be what Don Russell, Paul Keating's chief of staff, would be a pleaser rather than a doer. But in the longer run, the point of having power is to use it for a purpose. People will look to this in the lead up to the next election and say, okay, what is the offer from anyone who's running to be elected about the kind of Australia we're going to be at this critical juncture of building out of pandemic, but also the transition to a low carbon economy. It's absolutely urgent. And I made the point, I think, in the first essay about, the consequences of corruption and short-termism and chaos in the Bjelke-Petersen years were actually pretty bad in terms of the opportunity cost, the loss of talent, the loss of all of what Queensland could have been, people who didn't come back. Take that to the national level and it is a quantum degree of complexity and loss, and foregone opportunity is greater. And I think that should weigh on people's minds as they head into the polling station.